I want to move on to my second lie about slavery. And this is a little bit of a tricky one. I had said in, I think, the movie Hillary's America, that no Republican owned a slave, and that the vast, vast majority of slaves in America in the 19th century, I was thinking specifically of 1860, the year that the Civil War began, were owned by Democrats. Now, as it turns out, the second part of that statement is entirely true, and the first part of that statement is almost entirely true. And here's what I mean. When I said this, the point I was trying to make is that we think of slavery as a regional, the slavery fight as a sort of regional fight, the fight between the North and the South, that there were no slaves in the North, there were slaves in the South. That's what the Civil War was all about. Well, that's not even true. There were slaves in the North, and there were border states that had slavery. And the Civil War, while it had this sort of regional dimension, also had a partisan dimension. That's really what I was highlighting with my claim that no Republican owned a slave. Now, this was so upsetting to the left that a large army of leftist historians set out to prove me wrong, led by the historian Kevin Cruz at Princeton. And through prodigious efforts, they were able to identify about 10 Republicans who owned slaves. Now, how did this come to pass? I was kind of intrigued. How did it come to be that Republicans, largely, by the way, in free states, how could they own slaves? Well, as it turns out, there were some Democrats who owned slaves in border states, and they were worried about the coming of the Civil War because they thought the Civil War would defeat and destroy the South, would bring slavery to an end. And so in order to get themselves in good graces with the Republican Party, in order to try to prevent secession and civil war, in order to try to find some moderate compromise on the issue, these Democrats decided to move over to the Republican side, typically right about the time the Civil War was about to begin. And so you have this anomalous phenomenon of a very small number of, at that time, Republicans who nevertheless owned slaves, typically a very small number of slaves. So think about it. Let's put things in perspective here. In 1860, you have 4 million slaves. You have Republicans collectively in the entire country owning about 10. You have some other parties that have small numbers of slaves, and all the rest, 3,999,000, a giant number, the overwhelming majority of slaves owned by Democrats. So you can see here how I'm quite right that this is not merely a North-South issue, but it is equally dramatically an issue between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. To put it somewhat differently, the Republican Party was the anti-slavery party, and the Democratic Party was the pro-slavery party, and there are very small exceptions to this rule. Now, again, this is something that you would expect people to know, but almost nobody knows it. There are virtually no conservatives and Republicans I know who knew it until I pointed it out. I have never seen it not only in a textbook, I've never seen it even described or reported on in conservative magazines. So, for example, I've never seen an article in, let's say, the National Review or Commentary that talk about this. So, isn't it amazing how you can have something that is A, factual, and B, relevant? I mean, when we're talking about slavery, isn't it relevant? Instead of just saying Americans did this, Americans did that, isn't it relevant to ask which Americans did this? Why? Because we know that there were Americans that promoted slavery, but there were Americans that opposed slavery. There were Americans that drove the institution forward and wanted to expand it. And of course, the position of the Republican Party was not immediate abolition. Lincoln even said the founders had made a compromise with slavery. Slavery was present in the southern states. Lincoln was, I don't have the power, even if I wanted to root it out. But what I do have the power to do, and what I do want to do, and what the Republican Party stands for, is preventing slavery from going into the new territories. That's really was the issue that led to secession and to civil war. So there are inconvenient facts about slavery that are known, that are well established in the historical record. Nothing that I'm saying today lacks documentation. It's all there, and the documentation can't really be questioned. And I'm open-minded about this. In other words, when someone points out to me, I say, no Republican owned a slave. They go, well, what about this guy? I look into it. I go, well, actually, you're right on that. What about this guy? Actually, you're right on that. But let's add up your numbers. You're now under 10. So while what you say is true, and I'm going to take back my statement that no Republican owned a slave, I'm going to modify that statement now to say that virtually no Republican owned a slave, and 99.9%, the vast, vast majority of slaves in the country, were owned by Democrats. So the Democratic Party is unequivocally, unmistakably, indisputably the party of slavery, and that's a fact that young people need to know, but often don't.